No one saw it coming. Not the fans, not the media, not even those who had followed his life closely for years. A quiet revelation, buried in what seemed like an ordinary moment, suddenly ignited one of the most shocking narratives Hollywood had seen in a long time. Jamie Dornan, known for his intensely private life and carefully guarded image, was now at the center of a story that suggested something far more complex had been unfolding behind the scenes. And if the whispers were true, this wasn't something recent, it had been hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade. For years, his public identity had remained consistent. A devoted family man, a reserved actor who avoided unnecessary attention, someone who seemed to navigate fame without ever fully embracing its chaos. His marriage, his role as a father, and his carefully chosen appearances all contributed to a narrative that felt stable, almost untouchable. That's exactly why this new claim felt so disruptive, because it didn't just add a detail to his story, it challenged the foundation of everything people believed about him. At first, it didn't come from headlines or official sources. It began as fragments, small mentions, vague references, pieces of information that didn't seem significant on their own. But as those fragments started to connect, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. A recurring presence, a figure who appeared just outside the frame, never acknowledged, never explained, but always somehow there. Those who had worked around him began to hint at something unusual. Not directly, not in a way that could be quoted or confirmed, but enough to suggest that there had been a consistent presence in his life that didn't align with the public narrative. A mystery woman, as some described her, someone who had been seen at private gatherings, on set during select moments, and even in locations that didn't match his official schedule. What made it even more intriguing was how carefully everything seemed to be managed. There were no accidental photos, no obvious leaks, no moments where the story could fully break into the open. It was as if every detail had been controlled, every appearance timed, every interaction kept just out of reach of public visibility. And yet, despite all that control, traces remained, just enough to keep the story alive. Fans began revisiting old footage, interviews, and event appearances with a new perspective. Suddenly, small details that once seemed meaningless started to feel significant. A glance towards someone off camera, a sudden shift in tone during certain questions, even unexplained gaps in his schedule that had never been questioned before. Individually, none of it proved anything. But together, it painted a picture that felt increasingly difficult to dismiss. The idea that this could have been happening for 10 years added another layer of intensity. A decade is not a brief moment or a passing phase, it suggests consistency, intention, and a level of commitment that goes far beyond speculation. And that's what made the story so compelling. It wasn't just about whether the relationship existed, but about how it could have remained hidden for so long in an industry where privacy is almost impossible to maintain. There were also whispers about how those closest to him may have been aware, quietly respecting boundaries that were never meant to be crossed publicly. It wasn't framed as betrayal or scandal, but as something more complicated, a situation that existed in a space between personal choice and public expectation. And that ambiguity only made it more difficult to define. As the narrative grew, so did the tension between belief and doubt. Some refused to accept it, holding on to the image they had trusted for years. Others found the pattern too consistent to ignore, convinced that there had to be some truth beneath it all. And in that divide, the story took on a life of its own, fueled not by confirmed facts, but by the possibility that something real had been carefully concealed. Yet through all of this, there was still no direct confirmation. No statement, no clear acknowledgement, no moment where everything was laid out in a way that could settle the conversation. Just silence, and in that silence, the speculation only grew stronger. Because when something remains unspoken for so long, it doesn't disappear. It lingers, waiting for the moment when it can finally be revealed. And now, for the first time, it feels like that moment may be closer than ever. And then, almost without warning, the silence broke, but not in the explosive way many had imagined. There was no dramatic confession, no headline-making interview that laid everything bare. Instead, it came through something far more subtle, a moment that felt controlled yet impossible to ignore. A carefully worded acknowledgement, brief but powerful enough to send the entire narrative into overdrive. For those who had followed the story closely, it felt like confirmation, not of every detail, but of something undeniably real beneath the years of speculation. Jamie Dornan didn't offer a full explanation, nor did he directly validate every rumor that had circulated. But the way he spoke, the choice of words, the tone that carried both restraint and weight, suggested that this wasn't something he could simply dismiss anymore. What made the moment even more intense was how it shifted the focus. The conversation was no longer just about whether the relationship existed, but about what it meant. A decade is not just time, it's history, emotion, decisions, and consequences layered together in ways that are difficult to untangle. And suddenly, people weren't just asking, is it true? But, how did it stay hidden for so long? The identity of the so-called mystery woman only deepened the intrigue. She wasn't someone constantly in the spotlight, not a name that fans had repeatedly speculated about over the years. That alone disrupted many of the assumptions that had been built around the story. Because if she had been there all along, just outside the reach of public attention, it meant the narrative everyone believed might have been missing a key piece from the very beginning. Reactions came quickly, and they were anything but unified. Some fans felt a sense of shock, struggling to reconcile this new layer of information with the image they had trusted for years. Others responded with curiosity rather than judgment, trying to understand the complexity of a situation that clearly wasn't as simple as it first appeared. And then there were those who saw it as something inevitable, the kind of truth that, no matter how carefully hidden, eventually finds its way to the surface. What complicated everything further was how it intersected with his existing life. Questions began to surface, not always loudly, but persistently. How does something like this exist alongside the life he had publicly built? Was it a misunderstanding, a narrative that had been misinterpreted, or something far more layered that couldn't be reduced to a single explanation? The lack of clear answers only made the story more compelling. At the same time, there was a noticeable shift in how the media approached the situation. Instead of pushing for immediate clarity, many outlets began exploring the broader context, the nature of privacy in Hollywood, the pressure to maintain a certain image, and the reality that not everything fits into a clean, public narrative. It transformed the story from a simple revelation into a deeper conversation about what it means to live a life that is constantly observed but never fully understood. And yet, even with this moment of acknowledgement, the full truth remained just out of reach. There were no detailed timelines, no complete explanations, no definitive statement that could close the story once and for all. Instead, there was only this partial glimpse, enough to confirm that something had existed, but not enough to define it completely. In the end, that may be what makes the story so powerful. Not the idea of a hidden relationship alone, but the realization that even in a world where everything seems visible, there are still parts of a person's life that remain beyond public understanding. And as much as people try to piece it together, to connect every detail into a clear narrative, some stories resist that kind of clarity. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It emerges slowly, in fragments, leaving just enough behind to change everything, while still keeping its deepest parts hidden. In the end, that may be what makes the story so powerful. Not the idea of a hidden relationship alone, but the realization that even in a world where everything seems visible, there are still parts of a person's life that remain beyond public understanding. And as much as people try to piece it together, to connect every detail into a clear narrative, some stories resist that kind of clarity.